Chwant Eskanahe, my name's Savannah Sloat. I work here at the University of Waterloo in the Faculty of Science as the Associate Director, Indigenous Initiatives. I am Skarurit, or Tuscarora, as you might know it in English, and a member of Six Nations of the Grand River, which is one of the host nations on the Haldeman Tract. And it's a rare privilege to be able to introduce a scholar whose work has served as a primary resource for my own academic development. When I first engaged with Dr. TallBear's work, I was writing my master's thesis, and her book, Native American DNA, shifted how I approached the complexities of Indigenous identity and citizenship when I was looking at kinship frameworks myself. And I know that my experience is one small reflection of her vital impact and that her scholarship has had on our understanding of science, sovereignty, and belonging. Dr. TallBear is a citizen of the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate, a Dakota nation in present-day South Dakota. She's a professor in the Department of American Indian Studies at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities campus. She earned her BA in Community Planning at the University of Massachusetts Boston and a master's in City Planning at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She later earned her PhD in the History of Consciousness at University of California, Santa Cruz. So as I mentioned, she is the author of Native American DNA, Tribal Belonging, and the False Promise of Genetic Science. She is also the founder of the Summer Internship for Indigenous Peoples in Genomics, or SING, Canada. She's advised the president of the American Society of Human Genetics on issues related to genomics and Indigenous peoples. She's advised museums on exhibits related to race and governance and to Indigenous self-definitions. In addition to studying genome science disruptions to Indigenous governance, Dr. TallBear studies colonial disruptions to Indigenous sexualities. She's a regular panelist on the weekly Indigenous Current Affairs podcast, Media Indigena. She's also a regular media commentator in outlets such as CBC, CNN, The Washington Post, The New Yorker, The LA Times, APTN, and the BBC on topics pertaining to Indigenous peoples, science, and technology, on the politics of self-indigenization, and on Indigenous sexualities. She is a former Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation Fellow, and you can follow her on Blue Sky and read her occasional posts on her Substack newsletter, Unsettle Indigenous Affairs, Cultural Politics, and Decolonization. So it's my great honor to welcome Dr. Kim TallBear.
Hi everyone, nice to be here. Before I get started, I'm going to, wait, where should I put this? Is that good? That's good? Okay. You can come adjust if you don't like it, whoever is in charge here. Okay. So I'm going to talk about a method of writing that helped me do some theoretical work as well. So there's a kind of a relationship between the practice of the particular practice of writing and the thinking that happened. That'll become apparent in the talk. But before I do that, I want to talk about terminology. Okay. So don't be this guy. This guy, I don't really know him, but he appeared on my Twitter feed, and when was this, 2018 or something like that? Doesn't say there. So the University of Alberta, you know, when I was there, they were in budget cuts or something, and so that's what the story was about. But he tweets out, the real news here is that at U Alberta has a department called Native Studies. We are not a department, we are a faculty, first of all. And then he says, really? Is it located next door to the Department of Banjos? So, you know, I had to go find a picture of an Indian with a banjo, a banjolin. My musician friend told me it's a banjolin. I love that picture. I don't know who that is. There was no attribution. So terminology depends on where you are, when in time you are, and who you are. There is no universal, perfect, politically appropriate term to use. But he's running us down for still calling ourselves the Faculty of Native Studies. And I'm now in a Department of American Indian Studies. How retrograde, right? So I just want to talk about these terms. So I often tell people, when I was born in the 1960s, I was an Indian. This is a legal term, still very resonant in law. Then I become an American Indian in the 1970s, and then I became a Native American in the late 80s. I know you don't say this in Canada as much. We were never Aboriginal in the United States. We don't say that. And then we become Indigenous. Suddenly in the 90s, I got told I was Indigenous, right? And Indigenous is widely held up to be the most politically progressive, accurate term. I have another slide, not in this talk, but on how actually Indigenous is, it's got a real positive and a negative side. It enables this kind of global cooperation, talking to each other, thinking about lessons of decolonization. It's also increasingly used in a way that's disconnected from nation, from people, from land and waterscapes. And it is actually, I think, enabling self-indigenization. So Indigenous has its downfalls. So you will hear me when I talk, both in this talk and elsewhere, it may seem that I'm randomly switching between all of these terms, but I'm not randomly doing it. There's always a very particular reason for why I choose a particular term. My audience may just not know it. So I just want to remind you, it's really about thinking about who are you, where do you stand? Not everybody can say the word Indian. I know that hurts younger people's ears. It is still a very legal term. It's a term I'm comfortable with, but I'm old, right? So I would advise non-Native people not to use the term. Anyway, just wanted to give you a little heads up, and you're going to hear me use a lot of different terminology. I'm just looking at how my time is working here. Okay. How long have I been talking? Because my time's not right, so I want to make sure I go 40 minutes. I'll go till, what time should I stop? 3:50, okay. All right. So we'll go to the next one. I'm going to talk about the hundreds method. So this talk is organized around a series of hundreds or strictly 100-word poetic vignettes that describe relations with both humans and non-humans. So before I dig into the content, I just want to talk about that. So in 2014, I was a professor of anthropology at the University of Texas at Austin. That's the year before I moved to Alberta. And I was introduced to the idea of writing hundreds as part of an online writing group. So during the 2014-15 academic year, I wrote weekly with 6 other women living in different parts of the continent. And we each committed to write a 100-word thing on the same day every week and to share it with the group by email. So Saturday was my day. And that way, on each of the 7 days of the week, a different woman wrote and shared her 100 with the group. Now, some people were novelists. I was writing some of what you'll see today. People might have been working on a 100-word section from a grant, anything. Because 100 words is nothing, right? You can make yourself sit down for 5 minutes. My hundreds tend to take me several hours, but I like the discipline. I realized I make myself do exactly 100 words. I find that discipline incredibly generative. I'm otherwise very vanilla. I have no kink kind of things, but the discipline of the 100 words, I like to be confined within it. Okay, so now I'm going to, this is one of the first hundreds I wrote, and I called it biosocial. So any of you science studies scholars in here might know what I mean by biosocial. I am not strictly a social constructionist. I believe in the power of materiality, and the material and the social co-constitute one another. So that's the idea that I'm getting at in this term, although this is not about science, well, not really about science. Okay. And this 100 takes place at this little venue here, the Vortex Repertory Theater. If you go to Austin, they have a really great little bar outside. They're really feminist, really cool theater. Oh yeah, we're in a cool theater, right? And also there's a really neat bar outside, and this is where this takes place. Girls teetered by in baby doll dresses, on arms of boys in shorts with pockets. Americans are a bit boring, his tongue formed by French. We resumed funny fighting, pearly cocktails, strung through the bar's backyard galaxy, little red suns had insects orbiting. 2 decades since I inhaled inside his fine wrinkled shirts. He still teases and touches me, narrates an experiment. You must have jealousy. We are animals. You provide me 1 storm of love to assess. I require 3. But I fine-tuned a neurological lightning interrupter. Why is what we species were factual? Why not also our becoming? He was an atheist scientist, by the way, so. So the original 100-word collective that inspired my hundreds group originated with Emily Bernard, who is professor of English at the University of Vermont, and it started in February of 2009, that original group. Bernard's idea has since resulted in the founding of dozens, probably hundreds of writing groups. In 2019, some of you may know the late Lauren Berlant and my then colleague at UT, Kathleen Stewart, published with Duke University Press a book called simply The Hundreds, thus bringing widespread academic attention to this writing practice. In Emily Bernard's approach, a writer launches their piece from an idea, a phrase, a single word, or anything in the previous writer's 100 that resonates. So there are no limitations, again, in form or style or subject. And Bernard explained the process of writing hundreds in group as something akin to, quote, a Quaker meeting. If the spirit moves you, speak. Otherwise, let's enjoy each other's words in silence, rich and voluptuous, unquote. Okay. So when I first started writing hundreds in 2014, it was part of this autoethnographic writing practice that I began in 2013 on my Critical Polyamorist blog, where I documented an experiment with polyamory and forged a language to more faithfully theorize more than monogamous relating according to my personal historical, social, and geographic standpoints and from my location as an Indigenous studies scholar. So my goal was to engage in self-reflexive analysis combined with research in non-monogamy, sexualities, race, and Indigenous studies literature. So I brought this kind of personal experiments into conversation with my academic work. One of the things I wondered about was the capacity of Dakota and other Indigenous worlds to tolerate contemporary manifestations of consensual non-monogamy, or CNM is the term that we'll sometimes use in the community. So there are barriers to CNM not only within normative settler thought, but of course also within contemporary tribal communities. It's a word I use as an American. Upon whom settlers impose their life ways that have centered individualism, heteronormative, and patriarchal couple-centric nuclear families with all of the attendant inheritance rules. So this forced painful changes then, these kinds of impositions to my ancestors' traditional practices, where before colonization, it was not uncommon to see non-monogamous relations and marriage that structured more horizontal, reciprocal caretaking and property sharing among extended families, wherein women also owned property and could divorce. On that said, it would be incorrect to describe my Dakota ancestors and other tribal peoples as having practiced what we today call polyamory, which I assert is it's another form of settler sexuality that emerges in the 20th century. So I cite Scott Morganson, of course, of Queen's University. In his 2011 book, The Spaces Between Us, Queer Settler Colonialism and Indigenous Decolonization, Morganson defines settler sexuality as, quote, a white national heteronormativity that regulates Indigenous sexuality and gender by supplanting them with the sexual modernity of settler subjects. And then more generally, he describes it as the heteropatriarchal and sexual modernity exemplary of white settler civilization. So some might like to think that settler sexuality refers primarily to compulsory heterosexual monogamy linked to state-sanctioned marriage and its property regimes. However, Morganson's work highlights how it's not only the heteropatriarchal vanilla monogamists who uphold settler colonialism with their intimate practices, again linked to property, consumption, couple and marriage privilege. Morganson also shows in his work that it's also not rare for queers and polyamorous to uphold key relationship norms of the settler state, including property, consumption, and couple/marriage privilege. So if you haven't read his work, it's really quite illuminating. Oh, I know I had more here because that unicorn's there and I haven't talked about the unicorn yet. So when I took up the label critical polyamorist, it's with those kinds of thoughts in mind, right? I was reading Morganson's work, and I was trying to gesture to something beyond common polyamorous critiques of compulsory monogamy, critiques that resist compulsory monogamous norms around sex and dating, but which tend not to consider the role of racism or colonial structures in the monogamy system, including within marriage privilege. So for example, when I began experimenting in my early 40s with polyamory in Austin, Texas, my peer group was married for a decade plus, usually middle-class professionals with school-age children, and they were more often than not white people who had been raised in nominally or enthusiastically Christian households. This was Texas, after all. But the role of settler colonialism in compulsory monogamy and state-sanctioned marriage was never, ever on their radar. They tended to see the gender and sexual norms of their parents and grandparents, and often their formative churches, as stifling and often as biologically untenable. That evolutionary psychology book, Sex at Dawn from 2012, was tattered and well-read in many of their households. But they were mostly comfortable with the privilege they received from marriage. In fact, polyamory is where they turn to save their marriages and the accompanying financial and property benefits. The terms primary and secondary were common in that community to refer to the spouse versus lover, and so was unicorn hunting. Does anybody know what a unicorn is in this particular context? I've got one hand up, 2, 3, okay, maybe 4. Unicorn hunting. So the unicorn, so this is the practice of a mostly hetero male-female dyad, she might be nominally bisexual, who's looking for a third. They're often you know this, you just don't know that's what it's called. It's often a younger woman who tends to be less affluent and who is excited to have a relationship with the usually older married couple, and they call them a unicorn because they are as rare as a unicorn. So, this situation is heterosexual, class, and marriage privilege all the way down. Again, it's a good example of why normie polyamory, if I can call it that, is just another iteration of settler sex, again, with all of those gender things, the marriage privilege, the kind of property interests. So I learned a lot in my relational experiments, and then so that critical polyamorous blog and the hundreds I was writing that I started in 2014 just kind of tumbled out of me. So I'll read another one of the early ones called Temple. Henry is gentle. When his shirt came off, I was unprepared for the marks on his body. Bites and bruises on his neck, scratches down his back and arms, dried blood tracks gouged and routed, crisscrossing his topography. My breath sucked in. My fingers played the air, then lightly his wounds. Did they hurt? I felt several things in quick succession: shock, a twinge of disgust, then warming anger. Who would mark him with even a small violence? And he would submit? He apprehended the complex brew in my eyes. With a half smile, he said, "Oh, you should see her." Austin. She was not drunk. As full as her breasts was her heart. Genevieve breathed. "You're pretty. I'm gonna dance." She rose from where she'd squeezed between our two sets of thighs. May's palm polished her bottom. G sashayed away on so much leg and heel. Spring scent fluttered across the thrift store pearl snap of bearded dude at the bar. He eyed her over his Lone Star. Not one, not two, but 6 glossy heads followed her, undulating at 55. 12 eyes set upon her, nervous. Grew embryos of horror. When they hunger over bridal magazines, Genevieve will haunt them. So a focus of both my Dakota and disciplinary standpoint, my personal and my disciplinary standpoint, is the co-constitution of a people and a place. How do a people continue to emerge as a collective with all of their ologies in intimate, long-standing relation with place? With that subjectivity and also being a migratory person, I did not stick long in the critical polyamorist experiment with documenting only human polyamorous relating, but I could not help but consider the promiscuous, more than human connections connected to place, both home and away. From the Bay Area in California to Tokyo to the Texas flatlands with their cavernous thunderstorm skies, Texas wasn't home, but it was at the southern tip of my most beloved stretch of this world, the North American prairies. Whether as far south as lands presently called Austin or as far north as lands presently named Edmonton, I feel most grounded when living my life upon the prairies and alongside river loves, from the Big Sioux to the Mississippi to the North Saskatchewan. This one's called Fidelitas. I seek multiple tongues. Desires cross time zones. Body stretches like wings over white light nets, taut between peaks and a black, deep sea. Life giver. When my first land-love body sleeps on the Twitter feed, intermittent with shots and false dreams, I turn to a European dalliance, mouthing into morning headlines of violence in the streets of empire. Though we remember grief no less, my fidelity is no one relation bliss. I won't ask everything, partial sustenance, stories forged together, shared pleasure. Riverside. So far a soft winter, snow skies are purple pink. I am half here. How long does it take a soul to find the body when a body went thousands of miles away? I ache for that south place, for soil like a mouth's inside. The city smelled like an equator country. I fantasize of sultry air tumbling over thighs, my skirt pulled up. I left little lime popsicle lizard who lodged in a spindly limbed plant, hanging under skies where a million bats fly. I had music and lovers, but long was that land emptied of all the relations I need. So the same four people probably know what NRE is, right? Okay. So NRE is the polyamory term for new relationship energy. And the great thing about being polyamorous is you get lots more data than monogamous. Usually, although some people do monogamy in an interesting way where they might have more data than you. But so people tend to think, you know, who don't have a lot of data, that your true love, that NRE, no, it doesn't last. 1 to 2 years tops, unless you have a pull me, push me relationship. Polyamorous have studied this. So don't be discouraged when your NRE wears off. That could still be your true love. So I have a play on this term, SRE, summer relationship energy, and I'm comparing summer in Edmonton to NRE. It's very push me, pull me. No long thrust, no slow, deep cook. Summer is perceptible at 53.5 degrees north. It is when the ice mostly goes, save occasional evening pellets when bruised clouds build, shake wind like fancy dancers and cut glass purple, blue, beaded garments. Summer's tongue traces our breasts, skims kisses across lips, down necks. We widen our eyes, silence. Summer's gone. Its ghost, excuse me, its ghost more present than heat of life. I got something in my throat, like smoke. There's a little hanging around, I think. Okay. Summer's gone. Its ghost more present than heat of life itself. We long hard for summer in cool rooms, though the horizon is pink past midnight. Summer keeps us wanting its barely attainable touch. Summer relentlessly leaves us. Summer's love is never not new. Okay. So since 2021, I haven't added to the Critical Polyamorous platform, which is where I originally started writing these hundreds. I moved all of that, what I call extra academic writing, over to my Substack newsletter, Unsettle, which I know Substack is problematic. I just need to get the time to figure that out, that move. And so I still occasionally write on critical relationships on Substack, but I don't anymore segregate the kind of relationships and sexuality stuff from the broader stuff about human relations, because all of that is kind of interrogating or trying to unsettle settler norms. And also because I've stopped, I'm trying not to privilege sex, which I think I'll get into in the next couple of slides. I eventually moved into a space that I call more than monogamy instead of non-monogamy. And I probably, also being a science studies scholar who's dabbled in critical animal studies as well, I'm thinking alongside why the more than human versus the non-human, right? Which non-human and non-monogamy tends to center the things that we say that we're trying to surpass in our critical analysis. So more than monogamy in my definition is not relegated to human or sexual relating. My treasured companion for many years of my life have been rivers, you know, the North Saskatchewan in this picture that float outside the south-facing windows of my Edmonton home. Rivers have been my teachers. And I'm going to come back to that idea in a little bit. So my practice of multidisciplinarity or relating promiscuously every day with multiple knowledge forms also intersects my approaches to multiple relating with beings and spaces. As a social scientist, a humanist, and a writer, I also come from a Dakota people who insist on relational knowledge production, even under the imposition of settler hierarchies of life/not life. All these binaries we have to deal with, right? Human/not human. Culture versus nature, truth versus myth, and material versus spirit. Therefore, I do not separate and value humanistic forms of knowledge production from and over more than human and material observations and investigation. That's coming back to that biosocial idea. I think they are both important, and they're important in a way where they mutually shape one another. I'm going to go to another 100 called Cocoa, Sea, Sweetgrass, Earth. Her 99% cocoa voice melts over us, pressed together in well-hung space. At the art gallery book launch, perched on chairs too spare for ample bottoms, I trace the glass's edge with a thumb soft inside. Not unlike how I graze your perineum. Lids close, lips open, tongue tip probes the rim. Italian tide rolls in stone and gold, then pulls back, a placid goblet sea. A drop on my chin, aftertaste of cut prairie grass and that other teasing in between, the border zone of nose and palate. I sip liquid earth in wine. I sip the sea from you. So first I moved in from being a monogamist to a non-monogamist after decades of practicing solo polyamory. And that solo polyamory means having multiple meaningful relationships, but without the expectation of cohabitation or joining finances, marriage, and other normative relationship milestones, what polyamorists call the relationship escalator. You know that, right? This is if you're serious, if this is going somewhere. It always has to be going somewhere versus just like being a web of relation, right? So I give you a quote by Andrea Zanin, who's the author of a well-known blog of 20 years ago. I think it's still up. I don't think it's very active, called Sex Geek. And wrote this, published this book last year, a little over a year ago now in 2024, Post Non-Monogamy and Beyond. And so here's what she says about what post non-monogamy is. The purpose of this small offering, this discussion group in book form, is not to provide guidance on how or why to do non-monogamy or not. It's more like glancing around the circle and giving a gentle nod of recognition to those who've done it, and then for one reason or another, choose not to do it anymore. Not because of a change of heart about the underlying principle that it's okay to have multiple consensual relationships at the same time. We are post-non-monogamists, not anti-non-monogamists. But when I think about the more than monogamy idea, I question if I actually became post-non-monogamous or if this is, I don't want to just, I really truly am trying to figure it out, not just save face. So there are additional underlying principles that characterize my non-monogamous practice and that continue to ground my relationship practice that involves sex and romance with one other person only. But the core of what drove me to really think about non-monogamy in a really critical way still very much structures my life. So for example, I remain unwilling to exercise territoriality over others, including the one with whom I share an intimate partnership. I don't get to know everything. You know, what's inside his head does not belong to me, right? We need our private spaces. When I was writing this, I edited share a life with in that last sentence. Instead I wrote, I share an intimate partnership because he's not the only person with whom I share a life, with whom I am in regular relation. I share my life in that deep, consistent, regular way, which also might involve finances and or occasionally living together with several people, including my young adult child. She wanted to actually live with me last year, that was nice. My co-parent, we still share money and a lot of things, and a couple of other close familial relatives. So I think the lessons of a real critical form of polyamory, of trying to disrupt nuclear family, of trying to disrupt marriage privilege, of trying to disrupt that relationship escalator wherein you have to take all of these sequential steps if it's a real relationship, all of that continues in the way that I live my life. And it's possible to think about that as not non-monogamy, but more than monogamy, right? If you don't spend so much time fetishizing the sex part. So, in the last few years when I taught a graduate seminar in Indigenous Studies theory, when students introduce themselves in the first class, I've started to ask them to name their formative theorists. And normally we think of a theorist as an academic writer, but for me, my formative theorists came long before academia. My mother, my grandmother and my great-grandmother, these are the people who laid out the analytical framework through which I see and analyze the world, long before I knew words like theory and analysis. Like when I came home from school with whitewashed histories, my mother taught me that we as Dakota people should write and tell our own powerful stories from out of our own lives, that those stories were not actually what I was hearing in school, and the stories that I was hearing were really, I don't like the word biased, situated within a settler mind. And then my grandmother taught me to apprehend the world in silence and to listen more than one should speak. And my great-grandmother demonstrated care of self and others in a clean and orderly home, in a regular schedule, and daily back and forth between silent reading and active storytelling. So we all had formative theorists before we read words and books, whether we now approve of their thought or not. We all have people in our childhood who taught us to view and move through the world and to make sense of it, and some who came later who taught us to remake sense of the world, at least in part. Those are my formative academic theorists. And it's not only humans who form us, it's the land, water, skies, and non-human beings who inhabit these places too who are our formative theorists. And I would say especially, but not only for those of us from place-based tribal collectives, individual humans, ourselves, or our ancestors do not alone make us. The collective forges us, and the collective is also non-human. So I ask my students then, what about the landscapes or waterscapes that your people live with? How do you think they form you intellectually and morally? Of course, all individuals can answer that question, but not as a part of peoples formed co-constitutively with place. And it's interesting, I have them write for 15 minutes because I think they haven't actually thought about that, many of them, even though the majority of my students in an Indigenous theory class are Indigenous people. But how does the land and the water and the skies that we are most closely associated with, how does this actually form our worldview, right? How does it form our moral framework? So when I asked them that, I had to answer that question for myself. And these are some of my formative theorists, the river, academic theorists, my mother. And Vine Deloria Jr. is not actually an academic theorist. I mean, he is, but I knew about him when I was 5 years old. So he's actually at the level of my formation of my mother and my grandmother and my great-grandmother, because his writing in Custer Died for Your Sins was so permeating the American Indian movement, and I was a small child when that was happening in the early 1970s, so it was very, very early years formative. 5 more minutes? We're gonna go till 3:50, okay. So here's another one that's sort of getting more into the river formation. This one's called River Quantum, Instructions for Baby Girl, which is my daughter's nickname, even though she's 23. 1/4 my ashes to be spread across the North Saskatchewan, when ice flows and is lit by sun at a bend in central Edmonton. 1/4 to be blown across the heavy Mississippi, back to ancestors at Minneapolis, St. Paul. 3/8 shall be offered up to the Big Sioux, next to the old powwow grounds, make sure. That river is akin to my grandmother who fished its waters on close to home days when she did not venture to the Missouri. 1/8. The remainders of me shall be emigrated to the Corrib, my tumultuous river love near Galway's cathedral where I cursed Columbus. And that's the Corrib. Has anybody ever been to the Corrib? I can't see. It's so incredible. If you go to Galway, it's violent. It's always like that. I think if you fell in, you would die for sure. So don't fall in. Don't get drunk and fall in. Okay. So in my class, I wrote in my student silent time about my formative river theorists, which is when I began. There's another writing project that I actually started in that class, right? Just 100 words, it can spark something really, a new direction. And so in that time with my students, I began to articulate the influence of rivers in shaping my approach as an individual, also to my human relations. I was thinking, how am I like a river? And so thinking about how the river snakes through eastern South Dakota, it and the Mississippi River are my earliest river theorists, right? They're always there and committed to that place, but they're always going away. To me, a river was a road. And when you grow up in a reservation border town, quite often you're just looking to get out, you know? But it's also something that brings you back home. So it's both movement and it's both commitment to place. And I've been thinking a lot about that. And I've always wanted to go to where the rivers are. The sea scares me. But everywhere I go, I've lived next to the Russian River in Mendocino County. I love the Corrib in Galway. I love the North Saskatchewan. And so I think a lot about how they are relational guides, that they're committed, but they're away, and you can't hold the river back. I mean, you can, but that's a dysfunctional relationship. You know, you're trying to hold your partner to you and keep them all for you. Damming up a river is dysfunctional in the same way. So I'm thinking about that and some of the other work that I'm doing. And then I might have I'll read a couple more hundreds. I actually wanted to, that's my daughter when she was little too, she's so cute there. But I think I'm gonna move to the final 3 because I want to, they're a comment on the current moment. So I have a hundreds writing group now with Oceti Sakowin writers, so that's Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and there's 7 of us, and my day is still Saturday. And that's been really incredible, especially to write during this particular moment. So, I'm going to do 3 final 100s from that group and then stop. Reframe 1 and 2. The second hardest thing was returning to the settlers' America. But these waters and lands, beings that breathe here, exceed millions of Europeans' renamings. their straight marks and crooked justifications. The return is to an ancient terrain, to skies our ancestors studied, drew lines from to the earth. The first hardest thing was leaving a marriage. But an ecology of intimacies exceeds, defies centuries of settler mappings of a man's flesh-blood territory as husband and a woman's as wife. The turn was to a way of living together, sometimes, our child in the center, a place the settlers don't name. Sylvia sung over. This is about a different tribal tradition, 1,500 miles from my own. I'm about to sleep after standing hospice bedside in the living room with my partner and his family all day. I could not watch his mother take her final tiny breaths. I felt unentitled to the intimacy. I first met her this week. Her oxygen-deprived eyes rolled across us. I looked up at the ceiling, to the floor, upon oak trees' leaves shaking in windy sunlight while cousins' bird singing carried her over to her people in the stars. After awkward rosaries and a cousin speaking tongues, I took mental notes. My own mother will one day need this. Fingers crossed, pea balloons. The wind gusted to 40 today. Sun diamond hung in a fog of crystals above snowdrift fields. Golden prairie grass, elegantly waving through. My aerodynamic little car sped here anyway to Mom's cozy grandma res house. Post dinner, post dishes. We watch grainy reruns of Granny's favorite show. We love her in memory. 1972. So small on her lap, I laughed at her laughing. Mom's laptop alongside beads and moccasins in process. We catch up on the protests. We laugh harder than at Edith and Archie about weak-ass white supremacists in Minneapolis. We hope it wasn't water, but pea balloons thrown at them running away. And then here's the last one I did last week, I think. Promises, promises. The feminist luminary called California her promised land, took Cherokee too like a land claim. This land is your land, this land is my land. Academics' rainbow faces in Zoom tiles lament the waning of a grand promise, the US academic industrial complex. But the most pressing agenda item is rent relief, food, meds delivery to housebound targets. It is a day worth living to ease a physical suffering. To relieve their existential grief, the loss of settlers' bounty. This land is your land, this land is my land, is rarely possible. Surprised, rageful, wailing, their promised ground gives way. Thank you. And I have a blessing, my critical polyamorous blessing, which I came up with about 10 years ago. May your networks of love and relations be many, especially during this time, and not caged within settler colonial norms of rapacious individualism, hierarchies of life, and ownership of land, water, bodies, and desires. So thank you, everybody, for spending time with me.
My name is David Fortin. I'm a professor in the School of Architecture here at the University of Waterloo. I'm a Red River Métis, born in Calgary and raised in Saskatchewan. And thank you so much for that. So many layers, and yeah, I'm feeling a little bit like a fish out of water. We don't usually talk about these topics in architecture. But I guess, you really sparked something for me, and I've got a couple of questions or thoughts. And one of my recent thesis students was from India, and she was giving it was on Gurbani teachings in India. And one of the things she talked about was let's just say the trap of attachment. And in it, it talked about even your love for your children and your spouse or your partner being as a form of, to our detriment, being attached to things as part of our problem. It's kind of like a nirvana thing that she was talking about, right? But I asked her about it because I was like, but that doesn't seem right to me because the love I feel for my children is very different. And she said to me that in Gurbani teachings, and sorry if anybody of you if I'm butchering this, this is kind of winging it. In Gurbani teachings, she would say that you would understand that you love all children the same as your children. You can't love another child less than your own child. I wondered if internationally you've come across some of the things you're talking about in other contexts where teaching, is there
Like the fundamental ideas.
a fundamental idea that is there, and particularly on your polyamorous way of thinking about relationality?
Yeah, and I don't like the word polyamory either. Like it's like the word science. Can it be redeemed? Is it got too much baggage, you know? But that's why I'm trying to find language, right? And I'm sure, I think because what I'm trying to do is figure out, again, as I said, can a contemporary manifestation of non-monogamy, can that be worked in a way that's compatible with not only what I know from the archive and oral stories about non-monogamous relating among my ancestors, but also I see holdovers of the couple which I've written about this, right? The couple that creates the children are not the center of the family in many, I think, Indigenous families, right? So we still do have these kinds of horizontal kind of ways of relating, I think, even when we're still telling ourselves we're supposed to do the settlers' monogamy in the way that they do it, or we're what are the words we use? Immature, dysfunctional, whatever. Yeah, so I'm sure, so this is me trying to peel back the layers of settler impositions, and then what are we left with, right? Yeah.
Do you have thoughts? I mean, the thing I really took away from your talk today is you didn't talk about, and I guess it's in your work, you don't talk necessarily about transmitting Indigenous knowledge per se, but you talk about a frame of how an Indigenous mindset might build relations with places or see the world through that multi-relational lens. And I'm wondering, you mentioned in other words, you were in relation with rivers, which I think makes great sense here. For instance, the Grand River is such an important part of this area. And, people, I think, do you think people have trouble understanding, so for instance, let me back up. One of the teachings that I've heard comes from Wim Commanda, the Algonquin elder from the Ottawa region, and he says, you have to love the earth like you love people. Like it's a similar love, but people have a hard time understanding how you fall in love with landscapes. And
I think the word love is the problem.
Okay.
Yeah. I think it's kind of a trite word. I mean, we use it all kinds of ways, right? And like the word identity, we use it in all kinds of ways, and it means all different kinds of things. I love that dress, that's so cute, you know? So I think I would be looking for a more, you could be a theorist and come up with a more theoretical, incisive term for the word love. That might be different for a human or a river. I mean, I see what that elder is saying, and my challenge would be to find the word.
Yeah.
It's not love for me.
Yeah.
Do you have a word?
I don't know. No, I don't think so. But I'm thinking that
In one of our tribal languages, we might have a word for that.
Yeah.
And that you'd have to, I think this is why, even though I grew up not in an era of language revitalization, I do encourage my students to theorize, like at Alberta and Cree and Minnesota and Anishinaabe and Dakota, because there are ways to say things that we just can't do in English.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And I've heard in Anishinaabe one, and I won't try to do it because I know that I will definitely butcher that. But there are some words that I think capture some of the things that you're talking about.
Yeah.
And I love that when they say, well, that word doesn't translate easily. It's going to take me 4 or 5 minutes to tell you
Well,
what
and
that's.
exactly, and this is why it takes theorists or philosophers so long in English. You can say something, it might just take you a whole paragraph, and who's going to understand what you're saying?
Yeah,
But it doesn't mean something, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. All right, I'm going to check here to see, Wendy, if you've got anything. I'm looking out in the crowd.
But you can't see.
Can't see anyone. But we do have somebody ready to run around with a microphone. So can I just put up your hand? Okay, there's the one right behind you at the back there. Yep.
Thank you so much, Professor TallBear. I really appreciate your work and all of the kind of ways that you link things together. I really like the idea of more than monogamy as more than human, expanding the web of relationships. I guess my question is, I do a lot of like community organizing around like mutual aid and supporting our neighbors and things like this. And I wonder if you have advice for how to expand settlers' idea of relationality with others, especially what we sort of loosely think of as community or neighborhoods or this kind of thing, to gain the sense of genuine relationship with the people around us, especially for folks who, for example, like myself, might come from a very place-based culture but are not there anymore. And, you know, the ways that someone like me, or especially like white settlers, can get a sense of this idea of how to engage in this relational sort of like family building, for lack of a better way of putting it, with other people and with the land without engaging in appropriation or what you call self-indigenization. Sorry if that was a long and rambly question.
Yeah, that's a big question. I think these last 100s, I've been trying to figure out how, this is not a direct answer, but it's kind of in the same area. I've been trying to figure out how to decouple. I'm always trying to decouple, both for myself and to remind others, to decouple the settler state from the fact that we live in relationship to one another. And so I really push back, I always give a conceptual answer. I'm not an organizer. I don't have any practical guidance. You would have a lot more for me than I have for you. Everything is like, for me, is conceptual. I think before we can imagine a different way of being in relationship with one another and build the kinds of institutions where we're taking care of each other, we have to find a new story. If anybody knows that children's book about Frederick the Mouse, who doesn't gather all the food for winter, but he sits around and writes poems and stuff, you know? I'm Frederick the Mouse. I think we have to have a new guiding I don't like the word mythology, a new guiding narrative. And the guiding narrative of the exceptionalist settler state, where if you're good enough, you can become a citizen. There's always somebody who's killable. I think I didn't say that in some of my talk I left out. The settler state requires that somebody be killable. And right now, what we're seeing in Minneapolis is white people coming into the target area of the killable. And this is why they're in the streets. They're used to being outside that target area. It's people of color and other people that are the killable. And so they're beginning to get a glimpse of the inherent nature of the settler state, which is that somebody's got to be on the bottom, somebody's got to be outside of citizenship. And so we need to find another guiding narrative about how to live together that is not the settler state. And that's what I'm trying to do in those hundreds, right? It doesn't, and we Indigenous people say this, we see what you're afraid of because, we see that you know what you did because that's what you're afraid of. Right? And so, what's my answer? Again, not practical knowledge, but I'm trying to write a new narrative, and I'm trying to figure out how to say that as an accessible way as possible, and to communicate that to people, because I'm not trying to say I'm glad that I see these white people in the streets of Minneapolis getting it. Their rage is good for a time. It's not productive forever, but that tells you that they're beginning to see. And my question is, will they continue to see, or if they can push back the fascists enough to get themselves out of the killable range, will they let go? Will they stop? That's my worry. I don't think that was quite an answer to your question, but sorry, no practical guidance. Write stories that people will that they can grab onto, right?
Hello, my name is Rosalind, and speaking of writing stories, I am an aspiring novelist. My question, I think, really speaks to what you just said, because on my own Substack, as problematic as is, I wrote an essay like during the COVID lockdowns trucker protests where I argued the crackdown on protesters, if we remember from Ottawa, could happen because historically the Canadian state has treated Indigenous people that way. And therefore, as you said, when white people became the kill zone, they were protesting, and the Canadian state, for example, froze people's bank accounts and used violence systemically against them. That's when it really woke them up, even though most of them would be associated with the right wing in Canadian politics. That's a long note, but my question, because you're talking about placing things in connection to the earth, the land, the water, how do you as a writer do that faithfully, even if you haven't been to a place? Because part of imagination is allowing us to, for example, in my novel, which is set in the US, imagine living in another country, even though I've never lived there. And specifically the region I'm thinking about is Appalachia, which is really rich, both Indigenous land, but also a history of working class people, both white and brown, organizing together against violence specifically. And this is very nerdy. If you remember the Battle of Blair Mountain, I'm really thinking about that piece of labor history. Thank you.
So how would you write about something not having been there? Well, I'm a terrible fiction writer, and probably because I have no imagination. So I just would never do that. That's really, and I don't know, that's a question for another writer, I think, a fiction writer. I can't imagine doing that. But I don't know, somebody could say, you know, I think I'm walking next to the North Saskatchewan, but I don't really know it, right? Yeah, that's an over dinner conversation.
Any other hands up? Oh, there's one in the back row. Oh, one at the front. Okay, great.
Sorry, hi, thanks. Oh God, I hate hearing my voice. All right, hi. This talk was really great, thank you. I read some of your work in my last term for my queer and trans studies class. I believe we looked at your kinship work. But my question specifically, so you talk about how your Indigenous positionality impacted how you viewed and also wrote about contemporary non-monogamy and critical polyamory. With modern representations of polyamory and other instances of consensual non-monogamy being portrayed as very white and colonial-centered, it is often difficult to find accurate representation for relationships that do not follow the same structure as monogamous relationship with extra steps. I myself come from a background of media research, media communications, and gender research. So my question specifically is, how would you suggest, knowing what you know with your experience with writing your 100s, how can those who are writing non-monogamous relationships into both media and also from an academic standpoint into research work, how can they write in and work in decolonial practices and decenter humanistic ideals? And I apologize, I'm reading from a computer.
Well, I mean, it sounds like you know what you want to do already, right? So what do you mean by the how? Do you mean methodologically or?
I think methodologically or just as a standpoint for future writers or those who are trying to not necessarily like work in like, I know a lot of people have issues with forced diversity, but I'm not more so I'll just Mike. I think my point is more so on what can be done to decenter these practices, because at least in my experience, I'm not personally a writer for like a lot of fiction, but I see a lot of relationship, basically every relationship that is consensual non-monogamy that I've seen has basically just been a white woman, a white man, and then maybe another white woman. And it's very like cis, straight, like maybe one of them is bisexual and that's about it. But I think I see your writing with the human and the non-human, and how can those who are writing fiction work in these,
Oh.
yeah.
But I have no fiction writing skills. But it's interesting, you know, maybe
even
other
academic.
people are doing it differently and they're just not using the word polyamory, right? That's what, remember I said I think it might have too much baggage to be redeemable. I mean, I think, is that kind of an old person term too? I mean, I hear all the young people using different terms now, right? Maybe they are really doing relationships in different ways and they haven't just named it. You know, like a lot of young people identify as pansexual. Is that getting at something beyond? Maybe that's getting at more than monogamy in a way. But I do think it's really interesting to think about, you know, the terminology that you use and create, maybe working more, instead of trying to name things right away. And again, I'm not a fiction writer, so disclaimer, but as another kind of creative nonfiction writer, I would think about describing things versus naming them, right? Telling a story about how something unfolds. I mean, I don't think we have to name everything all the time. There is a moment when you know, naming something gives it traction. You can organize around it or advocate for it, but there's also those moments when maybe we shouldn't necessarily name something because we're still trying to figure out what it looks like and what the texture of it is. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
I think
These are
somebody
good
had their hand up
questions.
at the back row there, yeah.
Hi, thank you. So I'm coming to this conversation from a non-nuclear family parenting lens. I really appreciate what you shared around those concepts as a parent with multiple co-parents that I have to interact with on a daily basis with my children. And I just wanted to know, like, when you were talking about multiple co-parents who are not together romantically but will remain in relationships, whether that's through kinship or through financial responsibility, caring for the children, do you see the work that you've been doing kind of helping to break down those barriers in the societal understanding and acceptance of that for these new groups of children that are kind of growing up in these non-nuclear family homes where sometimes there can be multiple sets of co-parents because relationships break down over time, or whether they're polyamorous relationships? Do you see your work helping, you know, the next generation of children growing up in that for folks to understand and accept?
I mean, I just hope that, you know, I try to articulate I feel like all I'm doing is trying to describe in language the kind of the way that I grew up and that I was raised to think about these things. And I'm trying to articulate that way of that kind of matriarch, great-grandmother-headed extended family, right, where the heterosexual couple got no play, you know, and it was, I'm just trying to articulate that and talk about that as a really good way of being, right, with, I think, some of these ways that seem new. So one of the reasons that I resonate with a lot of queer kinship making is because it's really not so different often from the way that we made kin among Dakota people, right? And I'm happy to see, we might use different terms. Nobody in my family would talk about co-parents, right? You know, when an auntie or a grandma takes the kids half the time, you wouldn't use that kind of terminology. So I guess what I'm trying to do is have conversations in common with other people in the world. I don't like to get back at who asked about the appropriation. I think we do have to be careful not to appropriate from each other, but we can certainly articulate our ways of being and just be really conscious about the language that we're using and be conscious that maybe our genealogies are kind of different, but we're coming to a place in which we can inhabit this place together in a good way, right? And so that would go both for the newcomer and the settler and the Indigenous person in just everyday life. Are we coming from these different genealogies and places? How do we live together here in a way that's as mutually compatible as possible without evangelizing to each other? I don't have to use your language and you don't have to use mine. Right? I don't have to take on the label and you shouldn't try to take on mine. But can we live together in a way that's kind of sustaining, compatible in a way? You know what I mean? And so I wouldn't say that I see myself as, you know, I hope that maybe my work resonates with people and I'm really interested in how you do things, right? And how that might be not exactly what I'm talking about, but it's intriguing and it can open my mind to these other kinds of ways of being in a family. I don't think I'm being very kind of concise here.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah. I try to be humble about what I think I'm going to do, and I don't know. I'm glad people listen to me sometimes. Thank you.
We're almost done. I wanted to ask something, and I don't know if it's a little bit out of context, but at least I've heard in various contexts the role of traditional ceremony is one of those means where it's even kind of nonverbal way of relating, building relations in a kind of the spiritual realm, let's just say. I was thinking of some of your 100 posts to me. It seemed like it's almost felt to me like a different form of ceremony. I don't know if that's feels like ceremony too, but I'm wondering, like, I often wonder if the lack of ceremony in our lives has helped us detach from this relationship way of being, much more categorized, whereas I guess I'm just wondering, is there any role in your thinking in traditional ceremony or thinking of your work as ceremonial, or is it just not really relevant to you?
What's your definition of ceremony?
I guess, yeah, I think it's maybe ritualistic and spiritually based, something like that.
So I also critique the word spirit, but only because I don't, I think for me, writing in those moments of transcendence, which is maybe not the best word, but those aha moments, like when you really understand something, you really are like, oh, now you get that doing theory, you get that writing poetry. You do not get that using AI. Undergrads, you have to write something to know it, to know what you know, right? Knowledge is not something you apprehend out there and take off the shelf. It's something that you produce in concert with the thing that you're attempting to know, right? And so to me, I don't go to ceremony. Mostly because, I did as a child, but mostly because I feel like I don't need to. I get those moments, those aha moments of being at one with the universe and this moment of transcendence and understanding through writing. Right. So I don't know, is that ceremonial?
I think it might be.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks for the question.
I think we are out of time. I wanted to thank Kim again for joining us here, and thank you all for your questions and your attendance. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.